We begin where, in a very real sense, the tale began for Dante himself. And to understand his evolution as a poet and his devotion to the Lady Beatrice, we must travel back in time to one of Dante's first books, the prequel to his Commedia, if you like, La Vita Nuova, the New Life, written in 1294, his autobiography so far, in which he speaks of his great love. The book is a collection of sonnets and canzonieri, linked by a framework of prose. Of their first meeting, Dante writes, "9 times already since my birth, the heaven of light had almost revolved to the same point where my mind's glorious lady first appeared to my eyes. She who was called by many Beatrice, she who confers blessing by those who did not know what it meant to so name her. She had already lived as long in this life as in her time the starry heaven had moved east the 12th part of 1 degree, so that she appeared to me almost at the start of her 9th year, and I saw her almost at the end of my 9th. She appeared dressed in noblest colour, restrained and pure in crimson, tied and adorned in the style that then suited her very tender age. At that moment, I say truly that the vital spirit, that which lives in the most secret chamber of the heart, began to tremble so violently that I felt it fiercely in the least pulsation, and trembling, it uttered these words, "Behold, a God more powerful than I, who, coming, will rule over me." From then on, I say, that amour governed my soul. He commanded me many times to discover whether I might catch sight of this most tender of angels, so that in my boyhood I many times went searching and saw her to be of such noble and praiseworthy manners that certainly might be said of her those words of the poet Homer, "She did not seem to be the daughter of a mortal man, but of a god." Well, time passed, 9 years in fact, before the lovely lady acknowledges and greets our love-struck poet. When so many days had passed that exactly 9 years were completed since the appearance of this most gracious being I have written of above, it happened that this marvellous lady appeared to me, dressed in the whitest of white, between 2 gracious ladies who were of greater age. And passing through a street, she turned her eyes to the place where I stood greatly fearful, and, with her ineffable courtesy, that is now rewarded in a greater sphere, she greeted me so virtuously, so much so that I saw then to the very end of grace. And, by the hope embodied in that marvellous greeting, for me no enemy remained. In fact, I shone with a flame of charity that made me grant pardon to whoever had offended me. And if anyone then asked me anything, my reply would only have been, "Love, with an aspect of full humility. I left the crowd then, as if intoxicated, and I returned to the solitude of my own room, and fell to thinking of this most gracious one. But alas, this great love remained a secret, as did Beatrice's regard for him, if indeed it truly existed. For those were the days when marriages were arranged not for love, or to those with whom one fell in love, but for social and financial reasons, to secure land, influence, and favour. So Dante adores his beloved from afar, catching discreet glimpses of her whenever possible. Both he and Beatrice were later married to others, but of these marriages we hear little. Then tragically, as we have heard, Beatrice dies suddenly in 1290. Shortly before, Dante is said to have had a prophetic dream, most poignantly portrayed by the pre-Raphaelite Rossetti, in which she is carried away to heaven on the wings of an angel. Dante is broken and stricken with grief, and 2 years later he begins La Vita Nuova. Now the roots of this romantic style, in which Dante praised the Lady Beatrice, run deep, reaching far back to the distant days of the Persian Golden Age and the flowering of Arab mystical and romantic love poetry, that travelling troubadours, both male and female, had later brought north to the courts of Moorish Spain, and then onward, in the late 11th century, up to the French courts of high romance and courtly love in Provence, presided over, the legend tells, by Eleanor of Aquitaine and her daughter, the Countess of Champagne. Under their patronage, and whilst the menfolk were away at the Crusades, troubadours sang the praises of ladies, and platonic liaisons were permitted. The rules of chivalry and courtly love were established, by which such ladies were to be admired and wooed, often in secret, often from afar, and most commonly in unrequited fashion. Love for love's sake, the exaltation of the beloved lady, love as a desire never to be fulfilled. All these were aspects of courtly love. It was a time, too, of the rise of the cult of the Virgin, a time when she came more fully into the heart of things than had hitherto been the case. Devotions and praises were sung in her name. Depictions of her image proliferated, and she was adored and championed throughout Christendom by clergy and laity alike. But that's another story, too huge to fully enter into here. But suffice to say, the elevation of her status coincided with the rise of chivalry and courtly love. The great French romances were written at this time by authors such as Chrétien de Troyes, the famous 12th century cleric and poet, whose patron was the Countess of Champagne. He was the first artist to utter the word Camelot, and he penned the famous legend of Sir Percival and the quest for the Holy Grail, as well as the cautionary and tragic tales of Tristan and Isolde and Lancelot and Guinevere, which Dante will revisit in Canto 5 of his Inferno. Chrétien de Troyes employed the notion of courtly love and chivalrous adventure, notwithstanding its pitfalls and perils, as a potentially powerful, ennobling force. Yet as time passed, the genre devolved in a sense from what it had originally been, and drifted away from the sublime into more material, or some might even say profane realms, focused upon the physical dimensions of experience. And the tales and songs of lovesick suitors, hopelessly caught in lustful allure to the point of not being able to think or to function, began to dominate. The beautiful lady had been conceived and intended as the muse, mythologically the daughter of memory. Her role was to remind, to help the aspirant remember the higher ground that he is destined to travel. Well, eventually, this devolved style came down to Italy, where it underwent several further developments. The songs of the troubadours, hitherto accompanied by the lute, were put into the written spoken word, and Tuscan poets like Cavalcanti, who was Dante's teacher, began to ask questions about the passions aroused by courtly love. What was it, he asked, that caused such tremblings and uncontrollable palpitations of the heart? What was this lovesickness that caused such insomnia and lack of appetite? And in asking such questions, the Tuscans introduced an element of introspection, a bringing of the mind to bear upon matters of the heart, and in so doing, they created a whole new style of poetry that became known as the sweet new Tuscan style. The love of the lady, too, underwent modification, as it were, and she was elevated to new heights, envisioned more like an angel or a bridge to the divine. It was a development that returned the genre of love poetry somewhat to its roots, but it will be Dante himself, whose own La Vita Nuova and the evolution of his own experience and poetic style reflects this wider progression, who will fully manifest in La Divina Commedia the notion that love can become not only a secret erotic dream, but as a force that mobilizes the mind to ascend spiritually. Beatrice will become for him that force. And in finally finding his voice, through the ecstasies and agonies of love, he moves and actively propels his genre from the innocence of youth to the experience of full maturity. And it is this progression that we see reflected in the course of La Vita Nuova, covering as it does many years of Dante's experience and development as a poet. The first pages of his Book of Memory, as he calls it, reveal the passions of a love-struck boy a victim of love, if you like. And then, following the death of his beloved, he is overcome with unquenchable grief. How solitary lies the city, he writes, upon hearing of Beatrice's death. It has become as a woman widowed in the world. Whenever, alas, I remember that I may never again see that lady for whom I so grieve, so much grief is gathered in my heart by the grieving mind that I say, my spirit, why do you not go, since the torment you suffer in this world, which grows so hateful to you, brings such great thoughts of dread? Then I call on death as to a sweet and gentle refuge, and I say, come to me with such love that I am envious of all who die. La Vita Nuova is written wholly of the past, expressing the equally debilitating emotions of love and grief, until one miraculous moment that scholars have pointed out, a moment when there is a change of tense. Dante suddenly uses the verb to hope, sperare, and this hope is for a future project, a project that will become the Divine Comedy, the story with a happy ending, in which he will follow the path that leads away from the limitations of courtly love and even the sweet new Tuscan style toward a heavenly, sacred love. He does not know what that journey will be, nor what it will entail, but he is convinced that it will lead to a place, a state, if you like, from which love might be better understood. I will not write about the Blessed One again, he concludes, speaking of his lady, until I can write about her from knowing her. And this is the hope that completes La Vita Nuova, this notion of going forward out of private passion and grief and onward to the future. It will be the greatest work of his life, in which he will elevate the notion of the feminine to another octave completely, so that alongside the increasingly venerated Holy Virgin, mortal women too, like his beloved, will become imbued with the capacity not only to be man's inspiration, his muse, his bridge, but to inhabit the highest heavenly realms in their own right, and to guide the unwitting soul, as Dante depicts himself, into the embrace of the divine. And in so doing, he will reconnect the genre of love poetry to its highest and most sacred values, and to its deepest roots, fulfilling the promise inherent in the earlier writings of the Persian mystic poets, and in the visionary and archetypal writings of Chrétien de Troyes. Dante will gather the very best of what has preceded him to create a masterpiece hitherto undreamed of in the medieval imagination. Dante completed La Vita Nuova when he was 29 years old. He fulfilled this promise to write a poem worthy of his beloved, 27 years later, when just before his death in 1321, he finally completed his La Divina Commedia.